Thank you to Antonio Curaro and Paolo Cavaccioli for your kind introductions. And thank you to the festival for introducing me to this wonderful city. I have been asked to speak about artifacts in a festival devoted to art. Why? I hope my remarks today will provide an answer. We can't think philosophically about art without questioning the category of art, the category and its history. I will be telling a global, not just a Western history, a history of empire and decolonization. I will trace the careers, the life stories and travels of objects moving from non-Western places to Western museums of art and ethnology, where they have been understood in Western ways. So I will begin by recalling a moment of discovery that I discussed in my book, Roots. The Italian title is Strada. It was when I began to think of museums as contact zones, places of cultural encounter and translation. In 1989, in the basement storage area of the Portland, Oregon Museum of Art, a group of museum professionals and anthropologists gathered to discuss a remarkable collection of Northwest Coast and Alaskan tribal artifacts. The collection, purchased by the museum, was the work of an amateur collector named Axel Rasmussen, who in the early 20th century had acquired more than 800 objects. There were masks, carvings, blankets, rattles, bowls, hats, most of them dating from the late 19th century. What made the Portland Museum special was an invited delegation of Tlingit Indian tribal members from southern Alaska. The indigenous group included knowledgeable elders, older men and women who could recall the days when the artifacts were new. They remembered who had made them. To the museum curators and anthropologists, myself included, this seemed like a precious opportunity to complete our knowledge of the subject's traditional uses and meanings. How had they functioned in ceremonies and in everyday life? What was their traditional symbolism? What clans did they represent? What systems of prestige and reciprocity? We wondered, too, what these tribal authorities might have to say about the technical and aesthetic quality of the artifacts. You see an object? Good. These are just a few of the objects which we were looking at and which are held in the at the museum in Portland. Did we see this one? Yes. These are in the way? I'm sorry. They can't see the... Take them down. We'll work on it. Take them down. Good. So now we can go back to my face if you want to. I don't know if they'll do that. To our surprise, the Tlingit elders and their younger companions seemed to show only limited interest in the old objects when they were unwrapped and laid on the table. During the several days that were spent in the museum basement, most of the time was devoted to telling stories and singing songs. all with elaborate attention to clan ownership and tribal protocols. The performances were accompanied by tears, by joking, and by reminiscing. Political claims were made about tribal sovereignty, its loss in the past and renewal in the present. These claims implicated the museum in ongoing relations of dialogue and reciprocity. The Tlingit visitors to Portland had their own agenda. What was really important for them was not what interested us. We were interested in the material objects and their past functions. But for them, the objects were aide-mémoire, provocations for discourse, for old and new stories. What mattered was their performativity, the stories, the songs, and the histories they released in the present. I evoke this moment of encounter because it taught me the serious limitations of the ethnographic and aesthetic categories we commonly use to understand, to stabilize, and contain non-Western creations. The objects that came to life in the Portland Museum basement were neither cultural artifacts nor works of tribal art. They were something different, something for which we lacked adequate terms. Today, I'll be exploring the terms art and artifact, ways of conceiving creative material culture that have become increasingly problematic. My primary topic is artifacts, but we cannot understand the concept as it has been used in modernizing Europe and North America without considering its complementary partner, art. Thus, in the first half of my talk, I will be describing what might be called an art artifact system, exploring the system's cultural history and political functions. Since the early 19th century, the distinction between art and artifact has organized practices of collecting and the creation of separate museums of art and artifact, art and ethnology. I will suggest why in recent decades this classificatory system has begun to disintegrate. Then in the second half of my remarks, I will explore this changing terrain, this moment of crisis and opportunity. My focus will be on ethnological museums and their successor institutions in Europe and in North America, places where non-Western, especially tribal, cultural artifacts have long been stored. As ethnological institutions search for new roles and audiences, unprecedented narratives, performances, and indeed futures are emerging for their collections. These are exciting possibilities, both for the museums and for their newly diverse audiences. As I discovered in the Portland Museum storage area, the careers, the life histories of tribal objects in Western places are unfinished. The objects acquired by Axel Rasmussen a century ago now anchor a large exhibition of traditional and contemporary Native American and Canadian works. A full-time indigenous curator has been expanding the collection, collaborating with tribes in the region. This is a picture of the present exhibition display in the Portland Museum. And the fact that these former ethnographic artifacts are displayed in an art museum is very unusual and a sign of the changing times. Another sign, in New York City at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, their Native American collection was recently reinstalled, displayed now in the Gallery of American Art, with all the paintings and other artistic objects. This is a very new development. We can go back to the face. Well, how did the concepts of art and artifact become separated? A brief history. The British cultural theorist Raymond Williams has traced the emergence of a modern concept of art and its relation to social, economic, and cultural change. Williams observes that in the 18th century, the primary meaning of the word art was simply skill. There was no essential difference between an artist and an artisan or a craftsperson. During the 19th century, more specialized definitions of art, an artist, would emerge, as Williams puts it, under the pressure of events. But by the early 1800s, industrialism, with its class and democratic revolutions, had undermined the aristocratic patronage systems that supported artistic and artisanal productivity. A new figure, the autonomous creative artist, was taking shape, associated with romantic rebelliousness and the idea of genius. A special aesthetic sensibility would be embodied in works of art, a defense against anarchy, vulgarity, and materialism, threats that were associated with mass society and the relentless disruptions of capitalism. The artist, now clearly distinct from the skilled artisan, would become a familiar figure of modernity. By the end of the 19th century, art had been institutionalized in national museums, the inheritors, these museums, of aristocratic and monarchical private collections. A commercialized art market was emerging. I don't need to trace this familiar story, which has been written about a great deal. Today I want to emphasize the growing separation of art from other forms of skilled work, its elevation to a higher creative, spiritual, rebellious sensibility. In Europe, artisanal or utilitarian products would henceforth be understood and valued in museums of folklore or national heritage. A broad secular category, artifact, accommodated objects, from baskets and wagon wheels to clothing and weapons. Like art, the word artifact was acquiring a more specialized meaning. In the 18th century, it simply meant anything made by human skill. In its modern usages, it referred to everyday material objects and archaeological relics salvaged from the past. As art was acquiring more dynamic, creative, and universal connotations, artifact became more mundane, object-like, and inert. The concept artifact was also reserved for non-Western things. Over 3 centuries of trade, colonization, and empire, countless objects arrived in Europe brought by explorers, traders, scientists, missionaries. These collections of what were then called treasures, curiosities, specimens, or antiquities found initial homes in aristocratic or royal cabinets of curiosity. In the mid-18th century, the many followers of Linnaeus were amassing private scientific collections. These were precursors of the next century's great public museums of natural history, based on evolutionary principles. Exotic objects of social significance, such as weapons, tools, body adornments, and religious paraphernalia, these latter often called idols or fetishes, all these things found their way into ethnological institutions. The museums of ethnography, Volkerkunde, of the tropics, of man, they had many different names, were presided over by the emerging science of anthropology. The purview of these museums was, roughly speaking, the non-West. The French historian Benoît de l'Étoile has called them simply musées des autres, museums of the others. The art artifact system, with its separate art and ethnology museums, thus functioned to separate us from them, 19th century museums of anthropology understood their role as preserving the remnants of so-called barbaric, primitive, or savage societies. In the more relativist 20th century, these same objects would be renamed more neutrally cultural artifacts, specimens representing a very wide range of social and cultural functions. Until recently, however, they were not considered to be art, at least not art in the advanced Western sense. For there were exceptions to the denial of art status to non-Western creations. Works from the so-called great civilizations of Asia or of the Mediterranean and from Levantine antiquity were sometimes included in major art collections. However, such treasures were confined to the past, understood as witnesses to the faded glory of lost civilizations, or at best as early precursors of a more advanced Occident. The savage or tribal objects housed in ethnological collections shared this assumed lack of a future. They too were going nowhere in history. Colonial collecting over 3 centuries proceeded under Eurocentric assumptions of historical inevitability. Small indigenous societies, especially, were destined to disappear. Only the West could be dynamic. In fact, however, many small societies, they did disappear in the face of imperial conquest, and especially the devastating epidemics that accompanied culture contexts. But others survived, inventively responding to bad situations, preserving what they could from their heritage. The renewed vitality of indigenous peoples today makes it very clear that cultural transformation should not be confused with cultural death. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, tribal societies on several continents were, however, experiencing a time of acute disruption and demographic emergency. Some of the most extensive European collections of tribal material culture were amassed during this period. A small army of scientific and amateur collectors took advantage of the disarray of indigenous societies. If the last remnants of tribal material cultures were to be preserved, it was now or never. Around 1900, this so-called salvage collecting was understood as a kind of sacred duty, the preservation of a human patrimony. The acquired objects would find their final resting places in Western museums. Here they would be valued, understood, and cared for by knowledgeable curators. The collections contributed to a common patrimony, the patrimony of humankind. In 2017, all of this sounds familiar, but a little out of date, I hope. For indigenous peoples did not disappear. They are alive, politically active, and seeking access to the works from their tradition that have been preserved in Western museums. In changing times, the career, the life history of tribal objects isn't done. They have new roles to play as treasures of a recovered heritage, as resources for future generations, and as inspirations for contemporary tribal art. The 20th century has seen challenges to the art-artifact distinction, challenges that have accelerated in recent decades. The first and most famous breach occurred in 1907, when Pablo Picasso visited the Trocadero Ethnographic Museum in Paris, just as he was completing his iconic proto-cubist masterpiece, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. The African masks he encountered at the Trocadero were, he recalled, a shock and a revelation. I realized what painting is all about, he said, and he added, African sculptures are more beautiful than the classical works in the Louvre. Picasso quickly added mask-inspired heads to 2 of the 5 figures in his paintings. and he would henceforth become an avid collector of African carvings. We can see this in photos of his studios over the years. There are many, many such photographs as this of Picasso in his studios, always with African objects all around. They were, he said, constant witnesses to his developing art. We could cut now. Scholars have debated whether this personal discovery of African art was primarily about form, an affinity of African sculpture with Cubism, or the emotive magic of the masks, their ability to exorcise Picasso's demons of death and sexuality. I won't enter into this debate. I would just emphasize that to focus on Picasso, on the psychic and creative struggles of a certified genius, is to miss the wider changes that were beginning to destabilize the art-artifact distinction. The recognition of non-Western objects as art was the work of a generation of avant-garde artists and writers. Derain, Vlaminck, and Matisse had begun collecting African objects before Picasso's epiphany in the Ethnographic Museum. In the 1920s, the Surrealists' interest in Native American, Oceanian, and Arctic works was well established. Here is an example of the kind of Alaskan art that the Surrealists loved. André Breton's apartment in Paris was filled with non-Western artifacts in promiscuous company with European artworks. This is a photograph of André Breton's apartment before it was sold and bought by collectors. But much of it is preserved in the Paris Museum, Musée d'Art Moderne. We can cut. The 1920s vogue for l'art nègre was an important opening in the ideological and institutional walls that kept primitive creation separate from art and from fine art. But the breach in the walls was limited at its time and ethnocentric. European modernism tended to recognize its own preconceptions and desires, showing little interest in the complexities of cultural translation or in the existence of divergent aesthetic systems. The art it recognized looked like what was emerging in the West. For many years, the modernist primitivism, as it has been called, of Picasso and his generation would remain a limited avant-garde phenomenon. It was not until the early 1980s that African and Oceanian galleries opened at New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art. And it would be 2 more decades before France followed suit. There, over considerable resistance and with presidential interventions by Jacques Chirac, tribal artifacts finally entered the ultimate sanctuary of fine art, the Louvre. The result, the Pavillon des Sessions, remains, however, relentlessly formalist, and it still locates its masterpieces firmly in the past. If the former artifacts from ethnological collections have gained entry to museums like the Louvre, it is still on terms dictated by the dominant category, art. A full deconstruction of the art-artifact distinction required more than elite recognition or changes in art connoisseurship. It was rooted in profound political and cultural shifts, developments after 1945, whose consequences are still being reckoned with. I am referring to decolonization, an unevenly developing, unfinished historical process, always accompanied by neo-colonial forms of containment and reaction. Modern decolonization begins with political independence of India and most African colonies, the wars of liberation in Algeria and Vietnam, and movements such as Negritude, a dynamic African and Caribbean political, cultural phenomenon. In the 1960s, Black Power, an international force, would inspire red power. And by the 1980s, indigenous social movements were proliferating at local, national, and global scales. Well, this decolonization is a contradictory process. On every continent today, we encounter both neo-colonial hegemony and post-colonial emergence. Liberal governmentality supports and is challenged by the volatile politics of identity and heritage. These dialectical forces in struggle and synergy are active in contemporary museums of ethnology and art, challenging the taxonomic systems they embody. The two museums of art and ethnology are still with us, of course, but their separation is less absolute, the coming and going between them more frequent. Crucially, the works they contain, especially those from the non-West, can no longer be confined to a vanished past, a condition of non-modernity. As I learned in the Portland Museum basement, the stories carried by these traveling objects, their meaningful careers, are not over. The stories are being retold, curated anew by diverse authorities in new circumstances. My remaining comments will evoke sites of struggle and creativity in the new spaces that are opening up between art and artifact, between the West and its others. I'll report on some recent research I've been doing, visits and conversations conducted in European and North American museums, institutions that can be called, with appropriate hesitation, post-ethnological. Post does not mean after, not some whole new stage of development. Post suggests following from, something new that we do not yet have a name for. Of course, the challenges that are underway reflect particular histories, articulations of local, national, and global power. In places like Canada, the United States, also New Zealand, Australia, and Alaska, post-ethnological museums are located where native communities are nearby and can exert direct pressure. Museums in Europe are more distant and thus more insulated. But in a globally connected world, distance is not what it used to be. More than a few European museums, I've discovered, to my surprise, are responding to the pressures and possibilities created by indigenous dynamism. Post-ethnographic museums throughout Europe find themselves challenged to do something new with the collections that complex and often violent histories have deposited in their storage areas. Many aspire to transcend colonial pasts, to become post-colonial, a worthy but always ambivalent and perhaps impossible task. Material and ideological constraints impose limited room for maneuver. Funding is a constant struggle, except for in a few prominent state-supported cases. Ethnology museums today need to justify their existence in ways that the many proliferating art museums do not. Neoliberal accountability, rigid demands for a quantifiable return on investment threaten to reduce curating to marketing, a search for crowd-pleasing projects. To these structural pressures, we can add a widespread climate of hostility to multiculturalism and so-called political correctness. As renewed forms of nationalism, ethnocentrism, and racism gain ground, and not only on the extreme right, cultural diversity is under suspicion. Yet, what can ethnology museums be about, if not cultural diversity? During my research, I've participated in discussions with museum managers who argue that we have gone too far with cultural differences and should be communicating universalist, unifying messages. This often means to them returning to museums of humankind or of national culture. Diversity, yes, they think, but with a clear understanding that underneath we're all alike. This, I hear, is the reassuring message the public wants to hear. Confronting these arguments for universalism, which often reflect a nostalgic desire for a simpler time of humanistic or national unity, I've concluded that post-ethnological museums cannot give up on diversity, but they need to radically reconceive cultural difference, abandoning the essentializing strategies of older displays. The cultures of the world, both distant and nearby, need to be grasped as historical productions. Diversity, never pre-given, arises from specific relationships and dialogues. It's not a quality of taxonomic otherness, but a product of exchange and translation. Given limited time, I will pursue just one area of translation and exchange: the new relations and forms of knowledge being created in Western museums through engagement with indigenous societies. First, an image from the past. Dominating the entry to the American Museum of Natural History in New York City stands an impressive group statue. President Theodore Roosevelt rides on horseback wearing the Army uniform from the Spanish-American War. Below him, on each of the horse's flanks, walk an African and an American Indian. You can see the Indian in this picture. It's hard to imagine a better image of imperial paternalism. Roosevelt was a patron of the museum and also of the photographer Edward Curtis, whose heroic documentary project was premised on the so-called vanishing Indian. Roosevelt could not have imagined that the red man walking tamely at his side would be alive in 2017, filing lawsuits, blocking oil pipelines, and forcing tribal agendas and epistemologies into the work of museums. Perhaps we are coming finally to the end of the disappearing Indian and of salvage collecting with its worldview. This mode of authority premised on disappearance rather than change, on immobility rather than movement. Now, by contrast, I encountered a very different sculpture in Amsterdam at the Tropen Museum. On a stairway between exhibit levels, the work of a Dutch artist, Roy Villevoye. And this is, I insist, a sculpture. A black man wears shorts and a t-shirt. Life-sized and hyper-real, he is gently holding a white baby. The title is Modena, O Mama and Celine. And it commemorates a visit to Amsterdam from Papua in West New Guinea and the friendship that developed between Omama and the artist, whose daughter Omama cradles in his hands. It's a work designed to provoke questions about Dutch colonial histories in Papua and their post-colonial aftermath, about intercultural contacts today, about immigration and otherness, about breaking down dichotomies of us and them. Nothing can be further from the Roosevelt statue in New York. Now, the natives like Omama are going somewhere on their own, not under the tutelage of a great white father. The fact of indigenous dynamism is inescapable in nations like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, where today no museum can represent Aboriginal or First Nations arts and cultures without serious collaboration and shared authority. Even repatriation, the return of objects, long viewed as threatening a museum's fundamental mission. Even this now appears to many curators in less all-or-nothing terms, as an opportunity for sharing heritage and accessing new kinds of knowledge. Now for some examples of current changing practices. This is the Pitt Rivers Museum at Oxford University in England. It is an iconic 19th century museum. Its founder, General Pitt Rivers, was an influential figure in archaeology and evolutionary anthropology. He organized a vast collection of artifacts in a typological manner designed to show progressive development. The museum has not changed its name or abandoned its old-fashioned and idiosyncratic style. It has become itself a kind of historical artifact. The result is not, however, immobility. A research annex was recently added, and the staff currently encourage visits, consultations, and ritual performances by Blackfoot Indians from Canada, whose painted shirts of great spiritual power are preserved there. The Blackfoot visitors who come to the museum have been deeply moved and inspired by these shirts, which tell stories of their history. Responding to the tribe's request, the museum's conservators hesitated, took a deep breath, and loaned 2 of the very fragile shirts for use in a ceremony back in the tribal reservation in Canada. And in Oxford, visitors now look differently at the Blackfoot shirts, aware of their past, present, and future significance. And now a few more examples of collaboration. Just to mention, the Oxford Museum of the Cambridge Museum, of Ethnology and Archaeology encourages ongoing contacts with Australian Aboriginal groups, consultations that are becoming extremely routine there. And in the Netherlands, at the Leiden Volkenkunde Museum, ongoing cooperative relations have been developed with indigenous East Greenland and Suriname. Also at the Musée Quai Branly, Jacques Chirac in Paris, recently a Wayana delegation from French Guiana spent a month as part of a long-term collaboration. The young and old visitors worked with many heritage artifacts from the museum's storage. For a conservative institution like the Quai Branly, this was a very significant first step. I happened to be at a meeting that was organized where the visitors reported on their time at the museum. And I took these 2 pictures. This shows 2 of the visitors. In this case, they're speaking Wayana, and one of the older man is speaking in Wayana, and the younger man is translating into French. And here are 2 other younger visitors who are speaking in French. Now, another prominent institution, which is the Berlin Ethnologisches Museum. And this museum is embarked on exciting, but also troubling post-colonial changes. In 1997, Yupik Eskimo elders from Alaska arrived at the museum to spend several weeks with objects from their tradition that were collected in the 19th century. And Finop Reardon, an anthropologist who facilitated the visit, along with the Berlin Museum's curator, Peter Bolz, calls this Yupik experience fieldwork turned on its head, indigenous research, in first world institutions. The published accounts of the visit record encounters and performances similar to the ones I described in Portland. Very emotional reconnections of people with their traditions and with their past, and a lot of singing and storytelling. This is just a picture of the kind of objects from Alaska that are stored in the Ethnologicus Museum, and that the people came to visit and to, in a sense, reanimate. Now recently, with the new millennium, the Ethnologicus Museum has received an offer that it cannot refuse. Its location, present location, in a remote suburb of Berlin has long been a serious liability. Few make the journey. But now a large portion of its unvisited collection can move to a grandiose new exhibition and research center on the Museum Island at the very center of Berlin. Here is a picture of what is being constructed there in the center of Berlin. This is the Humboldt Forum, and it will soon open on the site of the old Hohenzollern City Hall from the 1890s, familiarly called the Schloss. It was a large Baroque structure that was destroyed during World War II, and in appearance, the new forum evokes a return to lost grandeur. And its name, the Humboldt Forum, appropriates the cosmopolitan science of the Humboldt brothers. After the horrors of the 20th century, the imperial 19th century seems almost innocent. To counteract any suspicions, however, of reactionary nationalism, the new forum's guiding theme is Germany in the world. The whole project is anchored by the ethnology and Asian collections from the Ethnologicus Museum. The project raises important questions. What kind of cosmopolitanism is being imagined? How is it entangled with contemporary globalization? Will Germany in the world be just another way to collect the world's cultures? A new kind of centering? The Humboldt Forum will, of course, become a major tourist destination, a complex commercial and scientific operation as well. It is planned to be a research center, a laboratory. What kind of research? Research for whom? Can there be real participation by non-Western indigenous societies from outside Europe at a time when borders are closing and becoming increasingly embattled? Time will tell. The Ethnologicus Museum, a marginal, underfunded institution, will be given a new life. This is a good thing, but at a cost. Only the best objects, and best in whose judgment, will be moved to the Museum Island. The rest of the objects are heading for a remote storage facility where access will likely be more difficult, both for academic researchers and visitors like the UPIC delegation. New life for the Ethnology Museum, in effect, may amount to its destruction. Now, another example is in Vienna. And in this October, the venerable Volkerkunde Museum, now rebaptized the Weltmuseum, or Weltmuseum Wien, Museum of World Cultures, will be reopening after extensive renovations. And in its collections are precious Amazonian artifacts from the early 19th century. Already relationships with Brazilian institutions and long-term collaborations with relevant Indian groups have begun and will certainly be part of the collection's future. Indigenous curators, have visited the museum and worked with staff on an exhibition. How far, one wonders, can innovations such as this go in creating a genuinely post-colonial relationship? This is an important question, but with no definitive answer. Some critics have already dismissed the widespread turn, and not only in Vienna, the widespread turn to so-called world arts and cultures, seeing only a new way of appropriating otherness, now in a globalized environment. This is an image from the web where we see the staff at the Weltmuseum announcing their new logo. Every museum needs, as you know, a new logo. On the question of whether the World Museum is a new form of recentering, in effect a form of neocolonialism, I'm more inclined to keep an open mind. In practice, the opening up of European collections, their decolonization, to the extent that occurs, will be a result of small shifts and the making of new relationships, some of which are underway. The context I have been reviewing challenge not only the concept of cultural artifact, but also that of primitive art. A good example is provided by the partnership that now links two formerly distant museums, the Chateau Musée in Boulogne-sur-Mer, which is a small French city on the English Channel, and in Alaska, the native-administered Alutiiq Museum on Kodiak Island. A precious collection of Alutiiq masks from the 19th century found its way to this provincial French museum in the 1870s, donated by a young French scholar-adventurer named Alphonse Pinard. Pinard acquired the masks just as the indigenous society on Kodiak was passing through a period of acute crisis. Without his salvage collecting, there would be hardly any well-preserved old masks left. After 1870, the craft of mask carving disappeared for several generations. It has now been revived, and thus the Pinard collection, long ignored, is a destination for Alutiiq native artists and activists. Over the past 2 decades, a series of visits and political negotiations have brought a large selection of the Pinard masks home on return visit to Kodiak in Alaska. And an ongoing cooperation between the two small museums has developed. The Pinard collection of Kodiak masks is being reconceived as an unfinished shared heritage. In the process, both partners have had to give up absolute concepts of ownership and repatriation. And they have discovered that old collections have the power to inspire new arts and rituals, becoming integral to a living culture. Last fall at the Chateau Musée, new arts from Alaska was on display in an exhibition curated by an Alutiiq carver. You see here the image from that museum. And the museum has now begun an acquisitions program for new Alaska native art. I'll just show you a few images connected with that museum. Here you can see on the left a traditional 19th century mask from Kodiak, Alaska. And on the right, a new mask created by a contemporary Alutiiq artist. Obviously, very inspired by the old mask. Some of the masks are used in ceremonies. They are danced. In this case, you can see in the background a mask which is inspired by one of the objects in the collection in France now being danced in ceremonies in Kodiak, Alaska. And sometimes the traditional masks, this is one of the older 19th century masks, have become inspirations for new masks carved by Aleutic artists who are producing, in effect, contemporary native art. All of these definitions of art are alive and active. And it's becoming increasingly common for curators all over Europe and in places like America and Australia, New Zealand. It's common for curators to think of their work not only as conserving and interpreting artifacts from the past, but as encouraging renewal. In this, they are following, there are many examples from elsewhere. These are just a few examples of the decolonizing work going on in post-ethnological museums. Of course, progress can be slow, and paternalist attitudes die hard. We are not in an age of post-colonial innocence, but little by little, through the development of long-term relationships, historical legacies of mistrust by both natives and curators can be overcome. Post-ethnological museums are becoming places for the co-curation of new knowledge, sites of negotiated, collaborative conservation. The objects in their care are in motion. Some return permanently or on loan, repatriated to their societies of origin. Others remain in the former colonial capitals, where they tell new stories. I believe this is as it should be. There is no single proper home for these traveling former artifacts. There is much unfinished business, but I hope I have convinced you that the conceptual and institutional spaces once occupied by non-Western artifacts have become more volatile and more interesting. Thank you.